All right, Matt, you get to close this up.
All right, so Green Day. There we go. Just pull up it there. So yeah, we're covering Green Day's Dookie, and in the opening montage, you heard "Welcome to Paradise," and now you're going to hear a clip at number 46 in the 1990s on Best Ever Albums, number 11 in 1994, number 228 of all time. It's Green Day's second highest rated album on Best Ever Albums, behind 2004's "American Idiot." This album did make Radiohead Rolling Stones rankings at number 375, and Green Day is ranked. I just had it here. They are ranked number 97 of overall artists on Best Ever Albums. So this is not their debut album. This is their major label debut. This is actually their third studio album that was released on February 1st, 1994. I looked up some numbers here. It is the 66th best-selling album of all time. And Green Day is the 109th best-selling artist of all time. So,
Oh, wow.
so they are quite popular, selling lots of records. And actually, earlier this year, guys, good timing on this. Dookie was selected for preservation in the U.S. National Recording Registry by the Library of Congress. So another one of those records.
Nice.
Artists that they were influenced by include the Buzzcocks, the Sex Pistols, the Jam, Bad Religion, Husker Du, Cheap Trick, the Ramones, the Clash, the Who, Operation Ivy, Dead Kennedys, Black Flag, and Van Halen.
Go back to list all those episodes that we covered those bands on.
Yeah, pretty much, right? I think in particular, Operation Ivy was Billy Joe. I think that was the band that kind of inspired Billy Joe Armstrong to pick up a guitar.
I think they were big Descendants fans too, weren't they? I know Op Ivy though was their big one.
I think that was the big one. He also spoke very highly of Van Halen. I think he saw a Van Halen show and it was like, I think I kind of want to do what Eddie Van Halen's.
It's fucking Van Halen, dude, like peak Van Halen. So yeah,
yeah.
It's like Kiss, you know what I mean? People like
is.
deviate from them, but there's just something about them that made every young boy want to start a band.
Yeah, I did. Oddly enough, because I was just talking about that with Sherry the other day, but I didn't see anywhere in my research any mention of Kiss. But not to say that.
Well, he's a little younger, so it would have been the Mm-hmm.
So they've influenced a lot of bands: Blink 182, Against Me, Yellow Card, At the Drive-In, Goldfinger, Paramore, My Chemical Romance, Good Charlotte, Fall Out Boy, Something Corporate, Sum 41. Lady Gaga, actually, the first album that she ever bought with her own money was Green Day's Dookie. So there you go. I think she was a big Green Day fan. They have 3 albums that reached number 1 in the American charts. That includes American Idiot, 21st Century Breakdown, and Revolution Radio. And their highest charting single is When I Come Around. That hit number 6 on the Billboard charts. And a little history on these guys. They were formed in 1987. By 15-year-old high school classmates Billy Joe Armstrong and bassist Mike Dirnt. They originally were under the name Blood Rage, and later changed their name to Sweet Children. They formed this band at Pinole Valley High School in Northern California. And in 1988, they bring on a drummer by the name of John Kiffmeyer, also known as Al Sobrante. That was his nickname. He replaced their original drummer, and they were signed that year to Lookout Records, which was the kind of underground punk label in Northern California. So that was like a big deal. There was actually the guy that ran that was in the Lookouts, the band called the Lookouts, which was a punk band in that area. So they signed to Lookout, and shortly before the release of their first EP, in April 1989, they changed their name to avoid confusion. That happens a lot, doesn't it? Like band has a name, and it's like, oh shoot, it's too close to another band. We got to change it. So there was another local band called Sweet Baby, and so they.
Or you could just put a country name in front of it, like the English or the American, right?
There you go. Right. That's right. Yeah. So they changed their name to Green Day after their fondness for weed, essentially. And in 2001, Billy Joe Armstrong admitted that it was, quote, the worst band name in the world. And I would disagree with that. The Goo Goo Dolls were still out there in 2001. So
also Candlebox.
Yeah, and Candlebox probably worse.
Toad the Wet Sprocket would get in there. Yeah, enters the chat.
Yes, I'm sure we
Better
can
Than Ezra is another particularly terrible one.
That is pretty bad. So the thing we also have to know about Green Day is, in the area that they came up in Northern California, the East Bay, right? So Oakland, Berkeley area, was the club on Gilman Street, the Gilman Street Club, which was kind of like, the place to play for the punk scene in Northern California. It was known as, it's very, very DIY, and they were very welcoming. So they had rules like back in the day, it's like no homophobia, no misogyny, no racism. Like they, punk, I saw a documentary on the beginnings of Green Day, and they were talking about kind of the punk scene and how in some areas it had kind of gotten pretty toxic, I guess you could say, pretty either violent or racist, and kind of discriminating against various groups. But the Gilman Street Club wanted to be just open to everybody. So it's where a lot of people like Billy Joe Armstrong, Mike Dirnt, who didn't feel like they fit in, within their classmates and stuff like that. It was a place that everybody could go to and feel pretty much welcomed. It was a no age limit. Not age limit, minimum age requirement. There was no alcohol, no drugs. It was all about the vibes and whatnot. So that was the place that they played.
You're gonna insert the sad music, Matt? Do we want to insert the sad music when it takes the inevitable turn?
Wah, yeah, it's coming. So they're playing at Gilman Street. It was hard to get a gig, around the place. So they did a lot of their own promotion, and they played anywhere that they could as well. Outside of Gilman, they played backyards and parties and garages and just anybody that would hire them to play. They actually played at their school, I believe, as well. And their debut album was released in 1990. Kiffmeyer left the band in late 1990, shortly after their first. They actually had like a nationwide tour. Oddly enough, they just kind of would get in a truck, and they would, they'd go to different places and call them, convince club owners to let them play. So he quits the band, and he was replaced by the drummer, actually, of the Lookouts, by the name of Frank Edwin Wright III, also known as Tré Cool. And Trey was a nickname that he went by since he was the third in his family. And Cool was added to insinuate it was like the French version, so they put the accent on the E, like Trey meaning very, and Cool meaning cool. So his name means very cool, in case you didn't know that. So there you go. So their second album, Kerplunk, sold a lot more copies than they thought it was going to, and they actually went on to supported Bad Religion on tour. And Lookout had trouble pressing, creating the supply to meet the demand. And the band knew that basically, like, we're getting too big, we need to go to a major label. And so a bidding war began, due to that success. And they eventually signed with Reprise Records, mainly because of the A&R guy and the producer, who was Rob Cavallo, who also produced this record. He was really the only one that the band felt like they connected to. So they do the unthinkable thing in the punk world in Northern California. They sign with a major label. So they played their last street on Gilman Street on September 3rd, 1993, under a pseudonym, actually, by Blair Hess. And after that, they were banned for life because they signed with a major label. So they were never able to play Gilman Street, except there you go. Yep. Except for one time in 2015, they did do a benefit show where they did return to play Gilman Street. But yeah, man, you can't. The cardinal sin of selling out, right? If the punk band and whatnot. But they kind of said in their interviews they knew that was going to happen, but they also were like, well, we're not going to go to college, right? Like, what else are we going to do? We love doing this, and this would be great to make a living. So yeah, we're going to sign a major label deal. So yeah, this album was a huge success. Obviously, it became big due to a lot of play on MTV and on the radio. The performance at Woodstock '94 was pretty infamous because it was obviously a ton of mud from all the rain, and the crowd was kind of a little restless. And Billy Joe Armstrong they started throwing mud and grass and stuff up on the stage, and he started throwing back at them and whatnot. So they started a mud fight, so that got all kinds of press. And so this album also won a Grammy for Best Alternative Album in 1995. And this just really catapulted them. And kind of really bringing punk to the mainstream. I mean, that's many of the things that I wrote, that this is kind of like where Nirvana broke down the door for grunge or, alt rock in that regard, because this was kind of the first real punk album that started bringing stuff to the mainstream and making it huge. And after this, many, many other bands followed. So pretty important record. Also one more thing. They also toured. I also thought this was interesting. So they toured with a band called Pansy Division. Have either of you guys heard of Pansy Division? Mm-hmm. So they were a pretty Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'll let you tell the story because it's an interesting story. But
they're another punk band, but they're these gay guys that like make some they're pretty open about their sexuality and with very descriptive sexual acts and like, you know, curse words in the language and that they use and stuff like that. Pretty edgy stuff back then, right? Even you can make it's pretty edgy today, just with some of like how overt some of the language was. But they brought them on tour with them, and so you get these big stadiums or whatever Green Day's playing, and then you get Pansy Division opening, and a lot of the crowd members would be like jaws on, like, what are we watching? You know, so they're credited kind of as like being a little ahead of the curve and kind of trying to normalize, you know, like the LGBTQ lifestyle that was kind of burgeoning in at that time frame. So always kind of on the cutting edge there, very open minded and very much living up to the mantras and the ethos of Gilman Street, even though they got banned from them. So yeah, I don't know, John. I don't know if I missed anything, but that was just general.
No, I mean, and the mantras of punk rock. I mean, people almost forget because they think punk rock is like stuff that plays fast, right? And stuff, but like punk rock, and part of the thing with Green Day. Well, I'll get into that later.
Yeah, well, it's your take, John. So go ahead. Why don't you go?
There's kind of like in America. Well, first I'll challenge one thing you said: the idea of bringing punk into the mainstream. Bringing punk into the American mainstream. Like punk was in the mainstream of Great Britain quite a bit. Like the Sex Pistols, the Clash, they were there. You know, in America, they didn't hit quite as much. Like the Ramones, people knew them, but they didn't cross over. That was like our bands. There was punk rock. So Green Day was like the first big punk rock band in America. And they were kind of an interesting thing because Billy Joe Armstrong like sings with like a little bit of a British accent. You know what I mean? He's almost like, it's a little bit, I remember when I first heard them, I heard them at pretty much, I think the perfect time to hear Green Day, which is like when you're like 14 years old. So, and I remember thinking, at the time I had started getting into punk rock quite a bit. And my first take was, like they do kind of what the Buzzcocks do, you know, because that's when you heard them, right? It was a very familiar sound if you'd been listening to punk because and we've covered some groups, right? Like they're not too far from the Descendants or a little bit of like what Op Ivy's doing. There's or Bad Religion, right? They're all there. But what Green Day was they were really young. They were accessible enough not to scare American audiences. And, you know, Americans are a little bit more basic, I'd say, a little bit. So like our punk couldn't be like really scary to break over, right? It had to be kind of palatable for the mainstream palette. And all of this sounds like I'm knocking Green Day, but I'm not at all. They kind of had the perfect alchemy of what it was like supposed to be, which is why Dookie sold a bajillion copies, right? And
but that's the thing. But did any of the British punk bands sell a bajillion copies though?
Not in America.
No, but they sold pretty well. They sold pretty well in Great Britain.
Yeah,
but better than you'd think. You know what I mean? Like, were they like as big as the Beat? No, but like they were. You know, they were playing Top of the Pops, dude, and stuff like that, the big bands, right? Like the Buzzcocks and the Clash and, you know, the Sex Pistols and stuff, right? They were very much in the mainstream in a way that the Ramones, right, were just not at that level. And certainly the 80s and 90s punk bands were not, right? And, it's so easy to see the DNA of what, like, Op Ivy was. It's like, what if we took ska and punk and made it very palatable with like pop rhythms. And punk always had sort of like a popness to it, but if you remember, like early punk was more indebted to like almost like late 50s 60s rock and roll, right, in terms of its sound. But this was sort of indebted to as much like the 80s, you know, punk sound, late 70s 80s punk sound. And you know, they also it helped that, you know, they were young and energetic and they had a good look. They made interesting videos from the beginning. And it almost seems inevitable that a group like Green Day would be huge, but it was different, right, in the mainstream. It's hard for me to process Green Day because I spent like a year and a half ahead of this, like getting into punk rock. And so they didn't jump out at me immediately like they did to so many friends of mine who found them. You know what I mean? It was like, wow, there's like a visceral energy to this. They were like the ultimate gateway drug into this type of music. And then the rest of the 90s and early 2000s, even into the mid to late 2000s, right? There's just a lot of people, this becomes the dominant form of punk rock to the point where you almost think this is what punk always has been. I think for Americans it is what punk always has been, but it's very much like almost like ska has the first wave, second wave, third wave, right? Yeah, this is definitely not like first wave punk. I might even go so far as to say it's not second wave punk. It's kind of more like third wave punk, right? Would be how I'd describe it. And it's really good. I will say this, having just seen this album performed in entirety live about a week ago in a stadium, which is like there's just funny things that happen in the modern music landscape now, one of which is like Green Day, like mainstream rock and roll Hall of Fame approved rock band, just like the Red Hot Chili Peppers. It's like elder statesmen of rock and roll. There's just weird things that like my younger brain would have a hard time I think in hindsight you can kind of see that if there was ever going to be a punk band that was going to be that, it was going to be Green Day, because they make sense if anybody was going to persevere. How they got there is interesting, because as I learned at that show, there's like the Green Day of the 90s, and then there's the Green Day like the rest of their career, right? And this is when they're still very much a punk band. The one thing I will say about this album is the highs are remarkably high. The singles are undeniably the singles, right? Longview was the first time I ever saw a video of theirs. It's a great video. It's very much of its time. When I Come Around, Basket Case, Welcome to Paradise, those are all massive big songs. You can identify immediately She as a big song, like a high level. I wouldn't even call it a deep cut. It was on the radio all the time. And then there's a couple, other songs. Sassafras Roots, really I remember turning to my friend who was a little bit less familiar with this album. I said, the first 3 songs go, I said, and now get ready for like a steady run of nothing but like bangers, like in a row in the middle of the album. And then it kind of ends with a bunch of like, 1.5 minuters along the way. I will say that this album is like 7 great songs, and then the other 6 songs are kind of like one song, and it's a pretty good song. And like as I was listening to it, what I mean? I'm like, this is almost like an EP, right? In which it's an incredible 7-song album. It's a very good 12-song album. You know what I mean? And I actually think some of their their next couple albums, we're going to cover a bunch of them. I actually think some of those were a little bit more consistent than this one was. They're still sort of finding their way into what they would become. They're a little bit more of like a proto version, certainly of the melody and the high level aspirations they'd have. But there's just something very charming about this album. And it's really hard to think about the idea that a punk rock band could go mainstream in America, because now the Gilman Street folks are just the scene. It's hard for me to say because I don't want to shame anybody, but it just also goes to show that we have no gatekeepers at all anymore in modern music. It probably haven't for like 15 years, right? So telling somebody the idea that signing a major label deal and you could get ostracized by your scene and absolutely no one would think that would be cool and stuff. It's like, well, these are the decisions you make. You know what I mean? When you do it, I could just see if you're like a millennial or Gen Z, right? You'd be like, what the fuck? Like, this doesn't make any sense. But I also can see like how this would be a polarizing album, right? If you were all about the scene, right? And then you break into the stratosphere. And 94 is that year, because there's going to be 2 other albums that come out this year that are huge. Yeah. I remember a friend of mine at the time who was a little bit more of a purist saying, this is punk for people that don't really want to listen to punk, which I thought was harsh. But once again, kind of states like what it was at the time, right? Yeah, it was like to him, his ears, it was a pop album. And then people who loved pop, it was like, finally, punk put something together that's worth a damn. You know what I mean? And it was kind of, Green Day resided in between those 2 worlds, right? And so it does it for me. And I wasn't quite the level of purist that those folks were. But this is the ultimate, like, listening to it and talking about it in 2024 and then thinking back to listening to it in 1994. It's just, and when I listened to it as a young man, it's just such a, I think like listening to Dookie for a lot of people was like what listening to Rage Against the Machine was for me in 92, where it's like, what is this sound? And you can do these things and make it also appealing to the ear. But yeah, that was a long set of thoughts right there. I mean, I know how you guys feel about this album, so I'm not gonna steal your thunder, so it's not a shock for me. But yeah, right. I mean, how can this not be an easy thumbs up? It's a great album, and it's sort of stood the test of time.
Yeah, I think I obviously I was younger than you guys there, but this is like one of the first tapes I got, I think. I remember listening to this and just, being blown away. It seemed like everyone was listening to this at some point as a 12-year-old, as I would have been at this time.
True story, Josh. My good friend Steve, who you guys know, we both were new to the high school that we attended, and he tells the story of when I first met him. I sat next to him, and he asked if I wanted to listen to Dookie by Green Day on the other headphone, right, of like his thing. So that's
nice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this is you're right. I don't think I processed it as like punk or it being that to me when I heard it, but I just, it's got the speed and the energy coupled with like these really great hooks and like the pop sheen over the punk rock kind of foundation. And that middle ground is why they were so successful, right? Being able to navigate that and be accessible to both the layman and, punk people that were familiar with the genre already. I was like shocked at how familiar I was with this album. I had not listened to it in such a long time, and I think I even like memory hold that I had the tape, but like I knew like every song on here. It doesn't hurt that it's 35 minutes or whatever, but yeah, it's just really hit after hit. And I agree with you, towards the end it starts kind of like the songs start running together to where I can't even, like, if I wasn't paying attention on one of the listens, they're like 2 songs past where I thought I was listening to it, because they have the same construction, and Billy Joe sings on all of them as the lead, and there's not a super amount of variety, but
it's like that riff that dun 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 dun, yeah, like over and over again.
Yeah, they tap into some sort of like classic sound too, because even Pulling Teeth feels like a cover of an oldie or something in the way it sounds. And I think the other thing I noticed too is just how the drums are mixed on this, and how it's so like evenly between the 3 of them. Like I can pick out the drums so clearly, and that being able to like air drum parts of the songs and like know when the drums come in is not something I know on a lot of albums, and maybe it's just the familiarity I have with this album, but I feel like that's a really valuable piece of people that are aspiring to be, kids that are hearing this and aspiring to be musicians, being able to pick out the instruments and stuff as well, or at least I can imagine that being. But I was just surprised too at like how many hits there were on this, revisiting it, or how many singles. I thought there'd be like 2 or 3, but there's really like 6, and so I'd forgotten that. That was a pleasant surprise. But then like Sassafras Roots, that one was great, revisiting as quote unquote like a deeper cut. And that's a good song that you pulled, Matt, for your choice as well. But yeah, this is like a no-brainer. This is a great album. Is it an elite album? I don't know. Like it's in terms of like, I don't know, major label debuts, it's pretty great. It was my first exposure to Green Day, so it's like quote unquote their first album. And it, American Idiot's probably a better album, more ambitious, but and I don't even know any of their later stuff. I've stopped listening to them, so like I don't know what that's like. But this is just a fun, like easy breezy record with the punk sound. So I love it. Thumbs up.
Well, I can tell you from having seen them live, and they played all of American Idiot and all of Dookie, it is remarkable how for some people Green Day is American Idiot and beyond, and like this whole 90s era does. And then there is another segment of the crowd that Green Day is the 90s, right? And there were definitely people near me who were on their phone when they played Dookie, and then were all in on American Idiot. And then there were definitely some older folks who Green Day played this, and then they start interspersing American Idiot in their later stuff, and they definitely walked out. Like at that point, it's like that my Green Day's done. You know what I mean? So it was very interesting.
At this point.
It wasn't everybody. Right? There were some that were both, right? You know what I mean? That's the cool thing. But it was, I don't think I ever thought of it as that hard to disconnect until I saw them play both. And it's like, it kind of does. It does make sense because it is 2 very different versions of the band. Yeah. So.
Well, I'd be one of those people that'd be very much into both. They're both elite records for me. And
this is almost like the punk album made for you, Matt. I was listening.
It is. I was
like,
say.
the Green Day Dookie is like doing punk for Matt's ears.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because there's punk that came after this, like a lot of these artists that they influenced, like a Blink-182, like a, I don't know, Sum 41 or whatever that became really popular and stuff. But there's not too many. Green Day's probably my favorite, right? Like if you're like, Matt, what's your favorite punk band of all time? It's probably going to be Green Day, you know? And I know that that's not true punk or whatever, but I don't care. Like there's elements of it. It's there. They come from that background. They put a spin on this. It's like they Beatlesqued their punk,
it's
right?
power pop is what this is, really.
And they do it exceptionally well. Billy Joe Armstrong can write a hook. And Trey and Mike are great. That's what they said when Trey joined the band. Mike Dirnt was like, okay, this guy's amazing. I really have to step my game up because Trey, and I love his jumping through this. It's just so fast and they're so tight and they just play so well. And Mike Dirnt is a great, they do harmonies, you know, like they harmonize it. Like how many punk bands are doing like harmonies at this time, right? Like it's just not a thing.
In fairness, the Ramones and the Buzzcocks had some pretty damn good harmonies if you go back and listen to their stuff. And the Clash too.
Mike Dirnt just stood out to me when I hear the harmonies that he did. It was just like very, very well done. So yeah, maybe there are other people doing it, but like this was way more melodic than I remember anything else being in terms of, you know, punk. And I don't even know how like exposed it's not like I had all this, you know. Now I knew probably some Ramones songs or like a Sex Pistols song, but I certainly didn't have the you know, the knowledge base that a lot of other people did. But that's probably one of the reasons this hit me so much, right? It was a different type of music. It was catchy as all get out. And it had edge. It was loud, right? And it was fast, and it just sat well with me. It sat very well with me. So, and it's a good length, right? It's a 40-minute length, and it's got, yes, I would say it certainly has the songs that stand out being the singles. It makes sense. I would defend some of the deeper cuts a little bit more maybe than you, John, or maybe even you, Josh. Maybe the, you know, tracks, you know, Coming Clean and then Amenia Sleepus, and in the end, you know, like, they're not the stronger tracks, but damn, they're really catchy, you know.
Yeah,
they kind of come in and they do blend a little bit. It's not like, you know, if I'm thinking, well, how does Coming Clean go in my head? I'm like, gee, I have to listen to that again.
I think that's what I'm saying.
Years.
Like they're just not as recognizable to me.
Yeah, and probably part of that's because maybe the hook and the chorus isn't what it is for other songs, right? You know,
I can tell you how Coming Clean goes. It goes exactly like Amenia Sleepus does. They have the exact same guitar riff to start the song.
Well, I mean, there's certainly similarities here. It's not like they're, you know, probably, you know, something like Longview's kind of different, right? That's kind of a unique song with the bass line like that, right? Oh, by the way, they all wrote that when they were on an acid trip, just hanging out in their Mike Dirnt wrote that on an acid trip, which I thought was funny. You know, so those songs, I see what you're saying, but I also feel like there's still plenty there. It's not like this generic kind of like throwaway, like doesn't do anything for me. It's like, no, when I hear them, like, yeah, that is a really good.
Oh yeah. They're still enjoyable
for sure.
Yeah.
You know, and so for that, I mean, this is a no skips record, right? Like even though I might like other songs better, this one, it certainly stands out. But I think it starts off great, but yeah, once it hits, like, you know, even Burnout, Having a Blast, and Chump in the beginning, those are all really good songs too.
Oh,
you know,
I agree.
But Basket Case is like, I remember when that song first came out, I was like in love with that song. I thought that was like a perfect, and I still kind of do think it's like a perfect pop punk, you know, rock song. It is so well done, and this is a fun band, and they've continued to, even though, you know, it's this album and American Idiot are the ones that I love the most, and know the most, and so I don't know all of their other stuff, but when I saw Green Day live and they would play like Minority and they play this, you know, all these songs, I'm like, I forgot about that. They're one of those bands that when you see, you're like, I forgot about that song. And even though they've probably gone a little bit over the top with they're very dramatic in their stage presence, and it's a lot of like, hey oh, and they're getting the crowd cheer back, and I'm like, just play the song, right? Like, I don't need a little bit of that is okay, but I will say
definitely Bruce Springsteen their performance. I can tell you from having seen them for sure.
And they
sound great.
And in my opinion,
say that.
Yeah, they don't. I don't think they do it as well as Springsteen. It just seems a little more contrived. But one thing they do is super cool. John, did they call up a kid to come play a song with them on stage?
They called up a girl to sing with them on stage. Okay. Yeah.
So they did this thing, and I remember seeing it, and I saw it in the documentary too, but I saw it live. They would call who can play these 3 chords, and they would pick some 15-year-old kid in the audience, and the kid would get up and play with them. Billy Joe's our guitar, and every now and then he would let the kid keep the guitar. Or he would let them crowd surf or whatever. And I'm like, what an amazing... nobody does that. I've seen tons of shows. Nobody does it like that. Yeah. And they're such a fun band. They really connect with the audience. And yes, they go over the top, but their records these days I'm not as familiar with, and it's probably a little bit too much. But man, when they hit, right, they hit as well as any band from this era, as far as I'm concerned. And I'm kind of upset that I missed that show, because I would have loved to see them play this in American Idiot. But I'm excited to cover that record too. But this was a fun going back to they have skills, man, and they are a great band. Big thumbs up for me.
Nice.